So my name is Rebecca Montgomery. I'm a faculty member in the Forest Resources Department here at the University of Minnesota. I consider myself a forest ecologist, so study kind of how forests interact with the environment. But within that, one of my specialty areas is tree physiology, so kind of the inner lives of trees, what they're doing that we can't see them doing, like absorbing carbon, giving off water, and, the inner life of trees, you might call it. Most of the work that I do ties into climate change impacts on forests, and that work often uses experiments to ask questions about how climate change might impact forests as well as how forests might respond. For example, I'm involved in a project here in Minnesota that manipulates temperature. So we have kind of infrared heating lamps, kind of like what you would have in a space heater in your home or in your three-season port, that we have out in the forest warming juvenile trees to see how they respond. That project also manipulates how much rainfall the trees are getting by kind of putting tarps out over our research plots during rainfall events to keep the rain from getting down to the plots. And that gets to kind of something I'm currently working on that I'm quite excited about, is a project actually in Puerto Rico where we are manipulating rainfall again, how much water is getting into the soils in a tropical rainforest there, and then looking at how that influences the forest. And that work is interesting in that there's these interactions there between hurricanes and these other climate change drivers like reduced rainfall and drought. The first thing that comes to mind is cool greenness, in the sense that I don't know if you've ever been out on a hot sunny day and kind of walking out in the open, and that transitioning into a forest on a day like that brings, at least for me, some relief in terms of suddenly you're in this shady, cooler, for me, much more kind of comfortable space, and the light is being filtered through the tree leaves. And so you have this green hue and dappled light. So I guess, the first thing for me is my personal kind of emotional reaction to being in forests. The other piece to that, I guess I would say, is when I think about forests, I just think about the incredible role they play in all sorts of aspects of our world. And one that just jumps to mind is, I don't know if you've ever seen this Keeling curve, which is the kind of trace of CO2 in the atmosphere. And most people focus on the fact that it's, ever trending upward as we emit more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But if you look closely at it, it has an annual cycle that goes up and down. And that annual cycle is really driven by the activity of forests in the northern hemisphere. And CO2 is high when it's winter and the plants are not, the trees and forests aren't absorbing carbon dioxide, and it's in that low when they are. And I just think that's amazing that we can see the signal of forests in the atmosphere every year, which is really cool. So that's like a big picture thing. They provide habitat, and by doing so really enhance biodiversity. They, in urban areas, they're important in terms of mitigating the heat island effect, influencing where water goes in the city, because they intercept the water and it runs down their trunks into the soil instead of onto pervious surfaces like streets and into our stormwater. They do those kinds of things outside of urban areas as well, so influence water. They're an important economic resource. If we look around us in my office, there's a lot of things made out of wood, and that wood comes from somewhere. So forests play a role in terms of providing wood products. And we're moving towards forestry that kind of works with ecological processes to manage forests in a way that's sustainable, including many of the forests here in Minnesota are certified by the various third-party certifications in terms of their best practices and sustainability in terms of management and provision of those products. I mean, I started the last question talking about how I feel in forests. So I think, forests also play an important role in terms of our personal well-being and a place where we can go and hike and enjoy the natural world, get personal renewal through spending time in those forests. I think in Japan, they have this forest bathing process, all these health benefits of just going and spending time in forests. So that's a bunch of different kinds of examples to mind for me. I think the public's knowledge is maybe kind of mixed. For people who've, go hike, I think they probably have a sense of it as a space that they enjoy spending time in and kind of those personal benefits. I think the awareness of a broader role of forests in terms of the, clean water and clean air and playing a role in terms of the global carbon cycle. I mean, who thinks about the global carbon cycle in the public sector? Maybe not a lot of people. I think they're aware of climate change and its cause. But, that said, I feel like there's been this rise of, tree planting programs and people recognizing that planting a tree has positive environmental impact. And so, I think in that sense, people are starting to recognize that the importance of that. I also think the public has misconceptions about forests, about how kind of dynamic and changing they are. Right. So I think the public will see like a wildfire and sometimes think, oh, how terrible and devastating, when in fact, in many cases, that's part of the natural process of renewal for forests. Not to say that's all forest fires, for example, but I think, disturbances are really important in forests in terms of their renewal and change. And I think that might actually be one of the most poorly understood things by the public is that, a tree getting blown down or burned up is actually part of that natural cycle. One thing that, the first thing that jumps into mind for me is on my email, I used to have this tagline, trees are amazing creatures, right? My mom always comments you should put that back on your email. She said that was always so impactful to see that, to remind me that these beings that just look like they're just this still thing in place are in constant internal motion, and what they do and makes such a huge difference in the world. And in terms of all the things, carbon and water and climate mitigation, I'm always amazed. And I would wish the public would have the sense of wonder that I always have when I look at a tree seed, like in the spring when the cottonwood drops their fuzz with these tiny little seeds, right? And then you look at that cottonwood tree. Where did it come from? Right? Where did it come from? It's like it's a miracle. It came out of thin air, right? But it reminds you, the air is, what an amazing thing that they can transform the carbon dioxide in the air into these amazing plant bodies. I'm always just if we all, every time we saw a seed next to a tree, could remind ourselves of the really wondrous thing that is. And this is my bias because I study photosynthesis, right? I study the process that the plants use light and CO2 to make sugar and wood and whatnot. And I'm, the forest is much more than trees, because I study trees and because I study how they work. I fall back on those areas that, really resonate with me through my work. Oh, favorite forest, favorite region. That's a tough one. I spent a lot of time over the last 20 years working in the pine forest, most red pine forest of this area. And so I think that forest, I feel drawn to that. Maybe it's a favorite area. I think the other thing about that forest is that I grew up in more open prairie areas, and actually, first time I lived in a forested place was when I was a graduate student in Connecticut, and I actually felt kind of claustrophobic, right? Like when all the leaves fell off the trees, I was like, oh, I can see, right? I can see a little farther. I was used to kind of the big views of being in a landscape without forests. So I think I'm kind of drawn to forests actually that are more open like that, and red pines forests are kind of a little bit more open character, a little more park, what we might call park-like in our perspective. And I think that connects me back to those prairies that I grew up on. Sense of place and place connection from where you grew up I think is strong in that. I had a friend who grew up in the Northeast, and they came out to Iowa, I think, and they felt like they wanted to curl up and get really small because they felt so exposed in kind of the openness of the more prairie and savanna landscape, which is the opposite of my feeling, right? It's like I get out into a more open forest or savanna or the prairies, and it's like, oh, I'm home, People laugh. They're like, why do you work in forests then? I was like, oh man, college, I was fascinated by tropical rainforests, and I wanted to learn about them and study them. And, so that's what I did. And then I just never looked back in terms of studying forests. I mean, I think part of it is that appreciation and wonder. And if we have that appreciation and wonder, then kind of our actions and decision making reflect that sense of kind of respect and responsibility for forests, for the natural world. If we brought to what we do that sense of respect and responsibility, I think kind of the world would be a different place in terms of our relationship to the natural world.